Welcome back to 3D Creations. This week we're going to be covering a few tools and techniques in order for you to better understand 3D printing, including importing and customizing additional objects from other sources. In this case, we'll be focusing on some tabletop miniatures and how to replace some weapons and accessories on those miniatures. Now, for this example, on a website called Thingivers, I have found player character pack number 3 by this creator. And why I'm choosing this one is it has a lot of miniatures available, but it is also available under the Creative Commons license, which basically means we are allowed to do whatever we want with it. This creator also has a YouTube page where we can watch him create all of these things if that's something you're interested in. It also just further solidifies that we know exactly the source of these objects. Now, this instance, I have already added a catfolk rogue and gave him a sword and shield instead. Maybe he's a little bit more of a fighter instead of a rogue. In order to do that, when you download the pack, or whichever pack, you'll probably see a variety of file types. In this example, we will be using the OBJ file type. It's just a type of 3D model. Now, in order to get that in, we can click on this import button at the top. And then you can either click choose a file and locate it there, or if you have it already open like I do, you can just click and drag it on over. This is going to be a bunch of stuff asking, oh, how big do you want it? What are the dimensions? But in this instance, for me, this object has already been fine-tuned for 3D printing, so it will be a little, about an inch tall. So we can go ahead and click import, and it will start work. My webcam is blocking it, but as you can see, it will pop up down here. Little progress bar, and once that is done, it should pop up. Okay, and it will come in at some random color. Go ahead and make it any other color you want. Most likely when you go to 3D print, it will be one solid color, so that will be determined by the resin available. I'm going to rotate it around so it's at least facing the right way. And as you can see, when I first brought it in, it had these dagger or short sword type thing going on, and maybe you want more of a fighter sword and shield look. Now, you might recognize this sword and shield because we created it earlier in a different tutorial, which brings us to our next style of importing, from Tinkercad project to a Tinkercad project. Now, to do that, you can easily just copy and paste, and there it is. There are other ways you could export this and then re-import it, just like we did with the catfolk, but it's really not necessary. Go ahead and just copy and paste, and we will be using these assets to switch up the weapons. Now, we don't want to be using a bow and arrow. This is not a spellcaster, and now we can pick between our swords and our shields. Let's do one of each. So in this case, since I've already done this one, we'll go with a round shield. So now that we have our shield selected, we can select our sword. Now, I went with this one because this crossguard is a little too weak, in my opinion, structurally speaking, when it's printed. When you start 3D printing things, the name of the game is thickness, especially when you're only printing something 1 inch tall or around there. Thickness is, you really want to make sure it's thick enough to support its own weight and it won't just break instantly. So for this instance, to save ourselves a little work, I'm going to use this one. Now, speaking of thickness, I am going to flatten this back out so that we will have the ability to thicken it up. Alright, that seems suitably thick enough. And you can tell by the width of the blades on the pre-made one that the width of the blade and the thickness of the cape, that thickness really is important, especially when printing this small. Um, Good rule of thumb, find the smallest thing on the model. Don't go past that. The ears are a little short, so they should be structurally sound. So for an example, I'm going to use the tail. Um, I don't want to go any thinner than that tail. Otherwise, it just will not support itself. That's just a general rule of thumb. It's not necessarily going to be accurate every time, but it's good to keep that in mind. In order to modify our original one, we have to get rid of these weapons that he currently has. So to do that, it's just going to be a matter of, similarly to things like the barn or uh, the cabin or any other project that we've done, it's a matter of just taking the whole box or cylinder and just cutting away what you don't want. Now, it will take some fine tuning because you can see the cross section, and we are cutting off his hand a little bit, which we don't want. There we go. That's about right. We want to make sure we're not cutting off his hand, but we do want to remove the majority of the blade, and by majority I mean all of the blade. But leaving a little bit right next to the hand, that's actually okay. Now in this time, you do want to have a fairly small box because we don't want to cut into his arm or his hand at all, if it can be avoided. One thing to note while cutting up things that will be 3D printed is if you misplace and you do cut off a little portion of his hand, um, it will interpret that and still give you a flat surface there. That geometry will not be lost. There we go. I think that's good. Okay, and with those two boxes, we can move on to his other one so that we can apply the shield as well. Got to be careful to not cut off the arm or the legs. So again, be careful, or the base. Keep track of where your bounding box is. This does take a lot of fine tuning. You have to be patient with it. Otherwise, you're just going to start cutting stuff off and you might lose some of the detail that you're after. And that's going to do it for cutting up the weapons off of the original. We can group that together. It will think about it. Now, what you can see is we did leave the parts of the handles that were interacting with his hand. Now, that is fine because his hands are only going to be like this big when you print them. So, one, no one will notice. Two, it just adds additional structure for us to attach our own weapons to. And three, it keeps the hands filled so it's not leaving a hole that might ruin the print. So now it's just a matter of just taking our own weapons, flip that 90, flip this over, and adding them into his hand. Now, if you want the Buster Sword look, that's fine, but I'm going to scale it down just a bit. There we go. Now, luckily, this shield, unlike our other shield, is fairly thick, which is good. I'm still going to make it a little thicker. We can scale it down, and it does already have a supported arm brace. So I'm going to rotate that 90 degrees. I'm going to try to do my best to match this bar with his forearm. You want as much intersection as possible because the more it intersects with the base, the more support it will have. And if you see how it's interlocking with his forearm, that's what we're after. Because without that, we want to give it as much plastic material to connect with. And there's a little intersecting at the back with his cape, but that's honestly going to be fine. Now we should be able to select everything and group it. All right. And these same processes can be used to replace heads, arms, hands, weapons, base plates, helmets, hats, capes, all sorts of stuff that you can just sort of tweak with to get the exact character that you have in your role-playing game or your tabletop game. When it comes to 3D printing, here's where the other half of importing comes in. Is we can export. We can go click on export and we can take everything in the design and we can download the OBJ STL or anything like this. There is this 3D print button, but those are for services and you won't need to use that. So you can just click OBJ and it will package everything in this environment and export it as an OBJ. Or you can select like just this guy. Export the selected shape and export as an OBJ. Then when you go to 3D print, you can take that single file and that is what the 3D printer can read in order to produce your 3D printed miniature that you then can paint and use in your games. So it's always good to know that you can import and export all sorts of things from across the internet, but make sure you know what you're working with and what you can and cannot do with what you find. Cool. Thanks for following along to this tutorial, and I hope it all made sense to you. Have a good week.